John Matthews, the CEO of a rapidly growing fast food chain, was used to boardroom meetings, strategic plans, and overseeing a vast empire from the comfort of his sleek office. But lately, something had been tugging at him, a nagging feeling that he was losing touch with the very people who made his company a success. His employees. The ones working tirelessly behind the counters, sweating over sizzling grills, and dealing with frustrated customers day in and day out. So, in an effort to reconnect and truly understand the challenges they faced, John made a bold decision: he would visit one of his busiest locations undercover. Dressed casually in a hoodie and jeans, he slipped into the bustling restaurant during the dinner rush, blending in with the crowd of hungry patrons. He ordered a burger from the cashier, who barely spared him a second glance as she punched in his order, too focused on the long line that stretched out the door. John took his receipt and stood in line, his heart racing with anticipation. He was excited. This was his chance to see firsthand what was going on beyond the polished reports and weekly updates. Little did he know, he was about to witness a side of the business that would deeply challenge his perception of success. As he stood waiting, John couldn't help but notice the stress etched into the faces of the employees. There was Maria, the shift manager, darting between the grill and the drive-through window, a look of sheer exhaustion in her eyes. He could hear her voice, calm but strained, as she reassured an upset customer about their missing fries. Nearby, Jason, a teenager working the fryer, seemed to be moving in fast forward, his hands a blur as he desperately tried to keep up with the orders piling up on the counter. The restaurant was packed, the air thick with the heat of cooking oil and the buzz of orders being called out over the intercom. The atmosphere was chaotic, but there was a rhythm to it, a frantic dance that kept everything moving, even if just barely. When John finally reached the counter to pick up his burger, he noticed something that struck him deeply. Maria handed him his meal with a forced smile, but her eyes betrayed the exhaustion she was hiding. "Have a nice night," she said, her voice tight. John nodded, but something lingered in the air, an unspoken weight that he couldn't shake. He sat down at a corner booth, quietly observing the scene around him. The employees were working at breakneck speed, each one seeming to wear a mask of professionalism, but John could see the cracks. He watched as one of the cooks, a young man named Andre, had to step away from the grill for a moment to compose himself. He wiped his hands on his apron, ran a hand through his hair, and took a deep breath before returning to the heat of the kitchen. It was in that moment that John realized how much pressure they were under, how their smiles were just thin veils for the exhaustion and frustration that simmered just beneath the surface. He felt a pang of guilt. Here he was, the CEO, enjoying a quiet meal in the comfort of his booth, while his employees were sacrificing their well-being to keep the business running smoothly. It wasn't long before things took a turn. A customer, clearly annoyed by the long wait, began to raise their voice at Maria. John could hear the frustration in the customer's tone as they demanded to speak to a manager. Maria's face flushed, her hands shaking slightly, but she kept her composure, offering a polite apology and assuring them their food would be out shortly. But the customer wasn't having it. The situation escalated quickly, with the angry customer insulting Maria and accusing her of poor service. John's heart sank as he watched the scene unfold. Maria's eyes welled up with tears, but she didn't break. She stood her ground, trying to keep the peace. And that's when John stood up. Without thinking, he walked up to the counter, his heart pounding in his chest. "Excuse me, sir," he said, his voice steady but firm. "Is there a problem here?" The customer paused, confused. "Who are you?" they snapped. John simply replied, I'm someone who values the hard work these employees do every day, and I don't tolerate people treating them like that." The tension in the air was palpable, but for the first time that evening, John felt a sense of clarity. He wasn't just an outsider here, he was part of this ecosystem, and it was his responsibility to ensure that his team felt valued. The customer huffed and walked away, muttering something under their breath, but John wasn't focused on that. He turned to Maria, offering her a small but genuine smile. "You did great," he said quietly. "Keep your head up." Maria blinked, surprise flickering in her eyes. She wasn't used to being treated like this, especially by a customer. But before she could respond, the dinner rush continued, and she was off to handle another order. John sat back down, his burger forgotten. As he watched the employees continue to hustle, a realization began to settle within him. He had come into this experience expecting to learn about the operational challenges, but what he was discovering was far deeper than that. It wasn't just about the mechanics of running a fast food chain, it was about the people who made it run. Their dignity, their exhaustion, their resilience. As John left the restaurant that evening, a newfound sense of responsibility weighed on him. He understood now that being a CEO wasn't just about profit margins and expansion, it was about leading with empathy, about making sure that every employee felt seen, heard, and appreciated. He'd never look at his business the same way again. Emily Dawson stood behind the cashier's counter with a practiced smile, the kind of smile that had become second nature over the months, masking the emotional turmoil she was silently fighting within. To the customers, she was just another face, another young cashier doing her job with a friendly attitude, offering polite greetings, scanning items, and making small talk to make the mundane act of shopping a little more pleasant. But what they didn't see, what no one saw, was the weight she carried each day, the layers of personal struggles that she had learned to keep hidden behind her calm demeanor. Emily had always been a fighter, but lately, her battles seemed endless. At just 23, she had already shouldered more responsibility than many her age, trying to help her family cope with financial difficulties after her mother's health had taken a sudden turn for the worse. She worked 2 jobs, rarely sleeping more than a few hours a night, just to make sure the bills were paid and that her younger brother, who had just started high school, didn't feel the stress that their household was drowning in. Yet, despite the exhausting cycle of work and worry, Emily felt as though she was always falling short, never doing enough. There was a constant, gnawing feeling of inadequacy that followed her, creeping into her thoughts when she was alone, when the lights went down and the world went quiet. She wasn't just struggling financially, she was struggling emotionally, too. The weight of her responsibilities had worn down the optimism that had once fueled her, leaving only exhaustion and a sense of isolation. Her friends had drifted away, unsure how to help, and her relationships with her family had become strained, as they, too, felt the pressure of their mounting problems. The shame of not being able to fix everything for them, a burden she had taken on, willingly ate at her from the inside. But every morning, Emily put on the same uniform, the same smile, and showed up for work. She didn't have the luxury of falling apart. When John, a regular customer, came through her line that afternoon, he didn't notice the faint lines of worry under her eyes or the way her hands trembled slightly as she handled his items. He didn't see how, as she scanned his items, her mind raced through a mental list of things she needed to do later: calling her mother's doctor, running errands for her brother, catching up on work at her second job, and yet she was still managing to keep up the appearance of normalcy, of everything being fine. John, like most customers, offered a friendly comment about the weather, and Emily responded with the usual pleasantries. It was a small interaction, but it held weight for her. It was a moment of normalcy, a brief reprieve from the constant pressure. But as he fumbled for his wallet, Emily's mind wandered back to the moment before she came to work, the phone call from her mother's doctor, the news of another test needed, another cost to cover that she couldn't afford. She fought to push the thoughts away, focusing instead on her work, on the small, repetitive task that felt like a distraction. Her body moved on autopilot, while inside, her emotions threatened to spill over despair, frustration, loneliness, but she was too afraid of what would happen if she allowed herself to break down, to acknowledge the depths of what she was feeling. It wasn't until John smiled at her, handing her the exact change for his purchase, that she realized how hard she had been holding herself together. His smile, warm and genuine, cut through her exhaustion for a brief moment, and it took all of her strength to keep her voice steady as she said, "Thank you. Have a great day." It was the same phrase she said to every customer, but in that moment, it felt like a lie, a facade she wore so often that it no longer felt like it belonged to her. After John left, Emily stood still for a moment, her hand resting on the register as she exhaled slowly, trying to regain her composure. The emotional toll of trying to hold everything together, of managing the daily grind of her life while carrying the weight of her family's struggles, had become suffocating. But no one knew. No one knew the sleepless nights she spent crying in the dark or the countless sacrifices she made to keep things running smoothly, to make sure her family didn't feel the full impact of their situation. No one saw how, every day, she pushed down her own feelings, her own needs so that she could be the rock for everyone else. And yet, despite all of it, Emily refused to quit. She had no choice. There was no room for weakness, no time for self-pity. She had a job to do, a family to care for, and a future she was determined to build, even if it felt like it was slipping further out of her grasp. Her struggle, hidden from the world, was a silent battle, one that left her feeling invisible, even in the midst of all her efforts. But Emily's strength, though not always visible, was unwavering. And while the world may not have noticed the sacrifices she made, there was a quiet dignity in her determination, a silent resolve that spoke louder than any words could. It was the kind of strength that didn't ask for recognition or reward, it simply existed, in the moments when no one was watching, when she fought to keep going, even when the weight of it all seemed unbearable. And in that, Emily's true resilience lay. As John approached the counter to collect his burger, he couldn't help but notice the way Emily's eyes seemed to flicker, betraying a weariness that went deeper than the long shift she had clearly endured. Her shoulders sagged slightly, and the usual warmth in her smile seemed absent, replaced by a tense sort of politeness that masked the exhaustion she was clearly trying to hide. With a soft sigh, she fumbled nervously with the coins in her hand, her fingers trembling just enough for him to notice. It wasn't just the usual clumsiness of someone counting tips or change, it was something more, a deeper, quieter distress that seemed to weigh down every movement. John, a regular at the fast food joint, had come to know Emily over the months, and though he'd never been particularly close to her, something about this moment made him pause. He wasn't sure why, but something in her demeanor told him that today was different. "Hey, Emily," he said softly, offering a smile that he hoped conveyed understanding. "Everything okay?" The words were simple, but they felt like a lifeline thrown into a sea of tension. Emily hesitated for a beat, and for the briefest moment, her eyes darted away, as though she were considering keeping her feelings buried just a little longer. The weight of her exhaustion and the quiet pressure she had been carrying for who knew how long seemed to close in around her. But then, in a sudden shift, her resolve cracked. Her face, usually guarded and composed behind her uniform, softened as her voice trembled, almost imperceptibly. I'm sorry, it's been a really hard week. The words seemed to tumble out all at once, unbidden, and Emily, startled by her own vulnerability, quickly clamped her mouth shut as if she could take them back. But John, sensing something far more significant than just a bad week, remained quiet, watching her with a mixture of concern and patience. I didn't mean to, she started, her voice faltering, but he raised a hand to stop her. No, it's okay, he said gently. You don't have to apologize. If you want to talk about it, I'm here. The reassurance in his voice seemed to unlock something inside her, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Emily allowed herself to breathe. She wiped her hands nervously on her apron and leaned a little against the counter, her voice barely above a whisper. It's just, everything feels like it's falling apart. My mom's sick, and I'm trying to hold things together with my little brother, but I barely have enough time to work and take care of them, let alone figure out how I'm going to pay rent this month. She paused, looking up at him with wide eyes, her expression raw and vulnerable. I don't know what to do anymore. Some days, it just feels like I'm running on empty, and I'm so tired. I'm not even sure I'm doing a good job at anything. I don't know if I can keep it all together. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with the weight of unspoken fears and a tiredness that went far beyond physical exhaustion. John stood there for a moment, unsure of how to respond, the enormity of what she had shared making him want to offer more than just a few comforting words. He'd never imagined that the girl who served his lunch with a smile, despite the chaos around her, was carrying so much. But there was something about the way she spoke so honestly, so openly that made him want to reach out, to let her know that she wasn't alone in this. He gave her a small, reassuring smile and then spoke, his voice soft but steady. Emily, I don't have all the answers, but I do know this: you're doing the best you can. And sometimes, that's all anyone can do. You're juggling a lot, and it's okay to feel overwhelmed. It's okay to need help, even if it's just someone to listen for a minute. There was a brief silence as she absorbed his words, her lips trembling for a second before she gave a shaky breath and nodded. The tension in her shoulders seemed to ease, just a little, as if a small part of the weight had been lifted. I guess I needed to hear that, she said quietly, her voice still soft but no longer laced with the same desperation. John offered a quiet chuckle, trying to lighten the moment. I think we all need to hear that sometimes, he said. None of us can do it all on our own, no matter how strong we try to be. Emily's eyes met his, and for a moment, there was a sense of understanding between them, as though they were speaking a language neither had known they shared. She smiled, a real one this time, the kind that had been missing earlier, and in that smile, John could see a flicker of hope, a recognition that she wasn't beyond help, beyond hope. Thanks, she said softly, her voice quieter now but filled with a sense of relief. As he grabbed his burger and turned to leave, John paused, glancing back at her. Take care of yourself, okay, he said. Emily nodded, her hands still a little shaky, but her shoulders a little higher, her posture a little stronger. I will, she replied, her voice steadier now. The moment hung between them, brief but significant, a reminder of how quickly a simple conversation can change the course of someone's day or even their life. For Emily, it had been the moment when the weight of her world felt just a little less heavy. And for John, it had been a reminder that sometimes, we all just need someone to listen, to let us know that it's okay to be human, to struggle, and to ask for help. Emily's hands trembled as she sat across from John, her eyes fixed on the worn table between them, the weight of the moment pressing down on her chest. The room, once filled with casual conversation, felt heavy now, as if the air itself had thickened with the gravity of her thoughts. She had always been the one to put on a brave face, to keep her struggles hidden behind a smile, but now, in the stillness of the evening, something inside her cracked. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was barely above a whisper, shaking with a rawness she hadn't expected. I don't know how much longer I can do this," she began, her words stumbling out, catching in her throat. John, who had been silently waiting, gave a subtle nod, his expression softening, encouraging her to continue. Emily swallowed hard, her gaze flicking to the window for a moment, as though trying to find some way to steady herself before diving into the truth she had kept buried for so long. "I've been working 2 jobs, she said, the words tumbling out faster now, as if the truth was rushing to escape, barely sleeping, barely eating, just to make sure my family has what they need. My mom's sick, my little brother's got school fees, and," her voice faltered again, the strain of it all catching up to her. She took a shaky breath, her fingers clenching into fists at her sides. "I'm drowning, John. I'm barely making ends meet. I don't know how I'm supposed to keep going." John, whose own life had always been relatively simple and uncomplicated, felt a surge of guilt wash over him as he listened, his heart breaking for her. He had known Emily for years, had always admired her resilience, her ability to juggle everything and still show up with a smile, but hearing her speak the words out loud, the vulnerability that she'd hidden so well, was a different thing entirely. He leaned forward, his eyes soft and full of understanding. Emily's hands began to shake harder, and she quickly tucked them beneath the table, unwilling to show him the depth of her fear. "I've been hiding it," she continued, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "I've been pretending everything's fine. I don't want anyone to think I'm weak, or that I'm not strong enough to handle it. I don't want to be judged for not being able to do it all. But, it's getting too much, John. It's all too much." The confession hung in the air between them, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Emily's words felt like an admission of failure, a surrender to the overwhelming tide she had been fighting on her own for so long. She had always taken pride in being the strong one, the one who never asked for help, who carried her burdens silently. But now, in the face of her own exhaustion, that pride felt like a weight she couldn't bear any longer. John's silence wasn't uncomfortable, but it was full of the kind of quiet understanding that made her feel exposed, vulnerable. She had never let anyone see her this way, not like this. And yet, there she was, speaking truths she hadn't even let herself fully acknowledge. His voice, when it came, was gentle but firm, a steady presence in the storm of her emotions. "Emily," he said, his eyes meeting hers with the kind of seriousness that made her chest tighten, "you're not weak for feeling this way. You're human. And you've been carrying this all by yourself for too long. It's okay to ask for help. It's okay to lean on someone else." His words, though simple, struck a chord deep inside her, resonating in the quiet spaces where she had buried her fear. Emily looked down at her hands, now clenched in her lap, the tears she had been holding back threatening to spill over. "But I don't want anyone to think I'm failing," she whispered, as if saying the word aloud would make it real, would confirm her deepest fear. John reached across the table, his hand resting gently on hers, the contact a comfort she didn't know she needed until that very moment. "You're not failing, Emily. You're doing the best you can. And that's enough." The room felt different now, as though the walls had pulled back just a little, allowing space for something that had been missing: compassion, understanding, the quiet realization that she didn't have to carry it all alone. Emily's chest tightened as she fought back the tears, but she couldn't stop the soft sob that escaped, the sound of release after so many months of holding it all in. She wasn't sure what came next, whether there was a solution to the weight she carried, but for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel as though she had to bear it all on her own. The exhaustion still sat heavily in her bones, and the future was uncertain, but in that moment, Emily knew something had shifted inside her. She didn't have to hide her struggles anymore. And maybe, just maybe, that was the first step toward finding her strength again, not in pretending everything was fine, but in acknowledging her pain and allowing herself to be seen for who she truly was. Vulnerable, yes. But also incredibly resilient. The air in the conference room grew heavy with each passing second, as Emily's words struck John with the weight of truth, one reality after another coming to light in ways he had never expected. He had always prided himself on being a good boss, the kind of leader who was approachable, fair, and understanding, but as Emily spoke, her voice laced with both frustration and quiet vulnerability, John realized just how much he had misunderstood the very people who had worked tirelessly to make his company a success. Emily's voice was calm but raw, each word carefully measured, but the truth behind them was undeniable. She spoke of the countless late nights, the unpaid overtime, the lack of adequate health benefits, and the emotional toll that the job had taken on her and others. As she detailed the personal sacrifices she had made, time with her family, the physical toll on her body, the mental strain of juggling multiple roles within the company, John felt a knot tighten in his chest. He had known that some employees were stretched thin, but he had always chalked it up to the nature of the job. He trusted his team, believed in their resilience, and admired their dedication. But Emily's words forced him to confront the uncomfortable truth: he had never fully seen them. He had never truly understood the lives of the people who worked for him, the real struggles they faced outside the office walls. His eyes flickered with surprise as he glanced around the room at his other employees, who were now quietly listening to Emily, their faces a mix of resignation and relief. He could see it in their eyes: they, too, had long carried burdens that had never been acknowledged. The shock of this realization hit him harder than he ever could have imagined. For years, he had assumed that success came from sheer determination and hard work, and while that may have been true for him, it had not been the same for everyone else. His assumptions had blinded him to the reality that his employees, despite their loyalty and hard work, had been struggling in ways he had never considered. Emily's honesty, her courage to speak up, left him speechless. She had bared not just her frustrations but her heart, revealing how little support she and others like her had received in return for their sacrifice. The silence in the room grew deeper as Emily finished speaking, her words hanging in the air like a heavy fog. John could feel the weight of every unspoken word, every moment of empathy he had failed to offer, every instance where he had missed the signs of burnout, stress, and exhaustion among his staff. He had always prided himself on running a tight ship, but now he saw that his focus on efficiency and productivity had come at the expense of his employees' well-being. The irony hit him hard: the very success he had worked so hard to achieve had been built on the backs of people whose struggles he had never fully acknowledged. He realized, with painful clarity, that he had been so focused on the bottom line, on profits, on deadlines, that he had neglected the human element of his business. The realization cut deeper with each passing second, and as he looked at Emily, her face still calm but her eyes full of quiet strength, John felt a deep pang of regret. He had failed to see the people who were keeping the gears of his company turning. He had failed to see the weight they carried, the burdens they bore. And worse, he had allowed a system to thrive that had left them vulnerable, unsupported, and unseen. His silence was deafening, and for the first time, he didn't know what to say. What could he say? How could he apologize for his ignorance when the truth had been right in front of him all along? The overwhelming guilt he felt was paralyzing. But amidst the shock, amidst the realization of his failures, a new clarity began to take shape. John understood that the change had to come from him from the top down. Emily's honesty had shattered the illusion he had held about the company, but it also opened his eyes to the urgent need for systemic changes. He could no longer ignore the deep disparities between his leadership and the real needs of his workers. The company, which had been his pride and joy, was in desperate need of a transformation, one that recognized employees not just as assets, but as human beings with their own struggles and needs. As the silence stretched on, John found his voice, though it was quieter than he expected. "I didn't know," he said softly, the words carrying a weight he hadn't anticipated. "I never realized what you all have been going through." His voice wavered with the shock and regret of his newfound understanding. Emily didn't respond immediately, but her eyes softened, as if acknowledging his sincerity. The moment wasn't about immediate solutions, it was about recognition, about finally seeing what had been hidden for too long. For John, the turning point was not just in the shock of hearing Emily's words, but in the commitment he knew he had to make moving forward. He could no longer afford to be blind to the needs of his employees. It was time for him to lead with empathy, to create a company that wasn't just driven by profits, but by a genuine care for the people who made it all possible. In that moment, John knew that the journey ahead would be long, but it was one he had to take for his employees, and for the future of his company. It was time for change, and that change had to start with him. The room felt quiet, the kind of silence that stretches long, not from awkwardness, but from the weight of a shared understanding that was only just beginning to form. Emily sat across from John, her hands clasped tightly together as she stared down at her lap, struggling to keep her voice steady. For weeks now, she had been juggling the pressures of her job while silently battling a difficult personal situation that she hadn't shared with anyone at work. But today, the burden had become too much to bear, and after months of keeping her emotions at bay, she finally found herself speaking out. She told John about the struggles she had been facing, how her home life had become overwhelming, the responsibility of caring for a sick family member while trying to maintain the standards of excellence she had set for herself at work. Her words were soft, vulnerable, and raw, tinged with a quiet sense of fear that admitting her weaknesses might make her appear incapable, or worse, that she might lose the respect of her boss and colleagues. The weight of the words hung in the air, and for a long moment, John simply listened. His expression was soft, his eyes filled with understanding as Emily's voice cracked, the tears she had been holding back finally beginning to spill over. She was used to the expectation of strength, the unspoken belief that personal struggles should be hidden behind the polished facade of professionalism. She wasn't sure what she had expected from John, but it certainly wasn't this kind of deep, unspoken empathy that seemed to fill the room as she spoke. After what felt like an eternity, John took a deep breath, his gaze steady but filled with an emotion that made Emily's heart skip. "Emily," he began, his voice gentle but firm, "thank you for sharing that with me. I can't imagine how hard it must be to carry all of that on your own. And I'm truly sorry that you've been dealing with so much." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle between them. "I want you to know that you're not alone. You don't have to carry this burden by yourself, and I'm here to support you in whatever way I can." Emily felt a lump form in her throat, her eyes welling up as the realization of what he was saying washed over her. She had been so used to pushing through, to pretending that everything was fine, that hearing someone acknowledge her pain felt like a release she didn't know she needed. John's words were not just an empty gesture, they were a promise. He continued, "I know you've been giving your best at work, and I can see how much effort you put into everything you do. Your hard work does not go unnoticed, and I want to make sure that you're supported, not just as an employee, but as a person. No one should have to go through difficult times alone, especially not while balancing everything else." His voice was sincere, and Emily could hear the conviction in his words. She had expected sympathy, maybe a few words of encouragement, but this was different. This wasn't just about work. This was about her, the person behind the resume, the employee, the caregiver. It was about seeing her struggles and respecting them, not brushing them off or pretending they didn't exist. For the first time in a long time, she felt seen. The tears that had been threatening to spill for so long finally began to fall, but they were different now. They weren't tears of frustration or helplessness, but tears of relief, of knowing that someone understood the weight she had been carrying. John didn't offer solutions right away, but he did something far more powerful. He offered empathy. He didn't rush to fix her problems or offer advice. Instead, he allowed her space to breathe, to be vulnerable, and to feel safe in that vulnerability. "I'll work with you to find ways to adjust your workload," he continued. "And if there's anything you need, whether it's time, flexibility, or just someone to talk to, I'm here. You don't have to pretend to have everything under control. You don't have to do this alone." His words wrapped around her like a blanket, warm and comforting, and for the first time in ages, Emily felt a shift inside her. It was a feeling of being genuinely supported, of not having to carry everything on her own shoulders. She nodded, wiping her eyes, trying to regain some composure, but the weight of gratitude and emotion was too much to hide. John smiled softly, a reassuring gesture that made her feel even more understood. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice shaky but full of meaning. In that moment, Emily understood that empathy in leadership was more than just about being understanding. It was about actively creating an environment where people could thrive, where they were encouraged to show up as their whole selves, not just the version of themselves that fit into a rigid professional mold. John had given her the most precious gift, the assurance that she wasn't defined by her struggles, that her humanity would never be overlooked. As she left the meeting, her heart felt lighter than it had in months, knowing that the weight of her personal life wouldn't define her place in the company. She wasn't alone. And, for the first time in a long while, Emily felt the kind of relief that comes when empathy is not just felt but acted upon. John sat at his desk, the weight of the decision pressing heavily on his shoulders as he glanced over the emails and reports that had flooded his inbox in the wake of Emily's resignation. For weeks, her story had been the topic of quiet conversations, murmurs of sympathy and frustration that swirled through the company. Emily, once an ambitious and passionate employee, had finally reached her breaking point, and the reasons for her departure were more than just a matter of workload or missed deadlines. They were symptoms of a deeper, systemic issue within the company. Emily had been a dedicated worker, always willing to go the extra mile, but she had been pushed beyond her limits. The company's support structures were broken, and the cracks had started to show. Employees were exhausted, undervalued, and overwhelmed, struggling with both their professional and personal lives without the support they desperately needed. The mental health resources were scarce, the wages outdated, and the benefits were far from adequate. As John sifted through the emails, he couldn't shake the image of Emily, her tired eyes, her quiet demeanor during her final meetings, her resignation letter that spoke volumes about the disillusionment that had built up over months, if not years. Her departure had been the tipping point for him, the catalyst he needed to see that change wasn't just an option, it was a necessity. His mind raced with the realization that the company could no longer operate as if things were fine. The culture needed a shift, one that valued the well-being of employees just as much as their productivity. John's gaze hardened with resolve. He knew that change wouldn't be easy, but it was necessary, and it had to start now. He picked up the phone and called his HR team into an emergency meeting. Over the next few days, he met with department heads, team leaders, and HR specialists, each conversation pushing the vision of a better workplace forward. The company's outdated employee benefits, the inadequate mental health support, and the wage structure that didn't align with the rising cost of living, they all became the focal points of intense discussions. John made it clear from the beginning that no stone would be left unturned. The first priority was to overhaul the employee benefits package, ensuring that healthcare, retirement plans, and paid time off were not just competitive but truly reflective of employees' needs. Mental health support, which had been nearly non-existent, would be expanded to include counseling services, wellness programs, and resources for stress management. John also spearheaded a review of the company's wage structure, making sure that employees were being paid fairly, with salaries that reflected their contributions and the reality of today's economic climate. It wasn't just about giving employees more, it was about giving them what they deserved: dignity, respect, and the opportunity to thrive in both their professional and personal lives. Emily's story became a rallying cry for the changes that were now unfolding. Her voice, though quiet and full of pain, echoed in every decision that John and his team made. He didn't want another employee to feel the way Emily had: unheard, unappreciated, and ultimately abandoned by the very system that was supposed to support them. Over the next few weeks, John saw the results of his efforts begin to take shape. New mental health programs were introduced, with regular workshops and confidential counseling sessions for anyone who needed them. The HR department launched an awareness campaign to reduce the stigma surrounding mental health issues, encouraging employees to seek help without fear of judgment. The wage review led to an immediate raise for many employees, ensuring that their hard work was finally being recognized and compensated properly. John also introduced a new system of regular check-ins, where employees could voice concerns and provide feedback on how the company could better support them. These meetings weren't just for the leadership team, they were for everyone, regardless of their role or seniority. The result was a wave of renewed energy and hope within the company. Employees began to feel heard, valued, and most importantly, supported. There was a noticeable shift in the office culture. People were more engaged, more collaborative, and, perhaps most importantly, they felt that their well-being was truly being prioritized. As the weeks turned into months, the company's transformation began to show in tangible ways. Retention rates improved, employee satisfaction surveys reported higher scores, and productivity increased, not because employees were working harder, but because they were now working in an environment that fostered respect and balance. The changes weren't perfect, but they were real, and they were a start. John knew that there was still much to be done, but the journey toward building a more supportive and human-centered workplace had begun. Emily's departure had shaken him, but it had also ignited a spark that would forever change the trajectory of the company. And while Emily might never fully understand the impact her story had on the organization, her courage in speaking out had set a chain of events into motion that would help countless others. For John, the lesson was clear: leadership wasn't just about making decisions, it was about creating an environment where every employee could thrive, where their needs were met, and where they were respected not just for what they could do, but for who they were as people. And as he looked around the company's headquarters, John felt a quiet pride knowing that, For the first time in a long while, the company was finally living up to the values it had always claimed to uphold. As the company slowly began to implement the new policies John had fought so hard for, Emily found herself experiencing a profound shift in both her work life and her outlook on the future. For so long, she had been caught in the grind, overwhelmed by the relentless demands of her shifts, constantly feeling the weight of exhaustion, frustration, and a sense of helplessness that had crept in over the years. The stress of her job had often felt suffocating, leaving her little room to breathe, let alone hope for anything different. But as John's efforts to improve workplace conditions began to take shape, Emily felt an undeniable change in the air. The new policies that focused on better staffing, manageable workloads, and a more supportive environment started to trickle down to the employees, and Emily was among those who immediately felt the difference. Her shifts, once a blur of exhaustion and anxiety, now seemed more manageable. She no longer found herself scrambling to keep up with impossible expectations or dealing with the constant pressure of being overwhelmed. With the introduction of clearer communication, fairer distribution of tasks, and increased resources, Emily's daily experiences became noticeably less stressful. There was even a sense of camaraderie that had been absent before, as her colleagues once similarly burdened found themselves with more time and energy to support one another. The stress that had once loomed over them like a shadow seemed to dissipate, replaced by a newfound sense of possibility. The changes were not just logistical, they were emotional. Emily's mental and emotional well-being improved as she was given the tools and support she needed to thrive in her role. The weight she had been carrying for so long seemed lighter, and with each passing day, she grew more confident in her ability to succeed, not just survive. She found herself taking on new challenges with a sense of purpose, no longer just going through the motions. It was as if a door had opened, and Emily was walking into a brighter, more fulfilling version of her career. But perhaps the most significant shift was in how Emily saw herself within the company. She had always been an employee, just another face in the crowd, but now she felt seen, heard, and valued. John's leadership had not only transformed the policies but had instilled a new sense of dignity and self-worth in the employees, and Emily was no exception. She wasn't just a cog in the machine anymore, she had become a symbol of resilience and strength, a living testament to the power of positive change. Her colleagues, many of whom had also benefited from the new policies, looked up to her as a beacon of hope. They saw in her not just someone who had weathered the storm, but someone who had emerged stronger and more empowered, ready to help lead others through their own challenges. Emily had become a quiet leader in her own right, someone who offered support, encouragement, and insight to those who were still adjusting to the changes. Her journey had come full circle from a place of burnout and defeat to a position of strength and influence, where she could not only thrive but also help others find their footing. The transformation wasn't just about Emily's personal growth, it was a collective shift within the company. As the new policies took root, the overall morale of the workplace improved, and the sense of unity and purpose that had once been fractured was now stronger than ever. Emily and her colleagues were no longer just employees following orders, they were part of something larger, a community that valued well-being, mutual respect, and shared success. The changes John had initiated had created a ripple effect that reached far beyond the workplace. Emily's new hope wasn't just about feeling better at work, it was about reclaiming her sense of agency and self-respect. It was about knowing that her voice mattered and that the efforts of one person could indeed create lasting change for the better. As she stood in the break room one afternoon, reflecting on how far she had come, Emily realized that she was no longer just the weary worker she had once been. She was a symbol of the resilience that comes from being treated with dignity, the power of having one's needs recognized and supported, and the impact of a leader who genuinely cared about the well-being of their team. Her journey had been long and difficult, but now, with John's support and the new policies in place, Emily could finally see a future that felt bright with possibility. And in that moment, as she shared a laugh with a colleague and looked out at the team around her, she knew that she had not only found hope for herself but had become a part of a collective hope, a hope that would carry them all forward, stronger and more united than ever before. Emily had always lived her life in the shadows of survival. Each day, she woke up to the grind of her job at the fast food restaurant, her spirit weighed down by the pressures of making ends meet and the relentless cycle of low wages, long hours, and little recognition. It was a life where she barely had time to breathe, let alone dream. But everything shifted the day she met John, the new manager who saw more in her than just a worker behind the counter. His approach was different from any boss she'd had before. He didn't just demand performance, he listened, understood, and offered genuine compassion. John's kindness was a spark that ignited a transformation in Emily, not just in how she viewed her job but in how she viewed herself. His belief in her abilities, coupled with his openness to change, gave her the courage to step beyond the limitations she had accepted for so long. No longer did she feel like a cog in a machine, but rather a valued member of a team, capable of growth and opportunity. The shift in her mindset was gradual but profound. She started arriving to work with a sense of purpose, her eyes no longer dulled by the monotony but bright with potential. Her interactions with customers grew warmer, her confidence blossomed, and she found herself taking pride in every task, from flipping burgers to managing the cash register. Emily's newfound sense of purpose was directly linked to the changes she saw happening within the company. John didn't just bring compassion to his role, he also worked tirelessly to implement systemic changes that improved the working conditions for everyone. No longer were employees expected to work without breaks, to put up with disrespectful treatment, or to face a stagnant future with no room for advancement. John fought for fair wages, better schedules, and an environment where employees were encouraged to speak up, to grow, and to build careers, not just fill shifts. These changes didn't happen overnight, but the gradual shift toward a more empathetic, employee-centered workplace was palpable. Emily witnessed this firsthand. She saw colleagues who once felt invisible now thriving, sharing ideas, and supporting each other. There was a camaraderie among the staff, a shared understanding that they were all in this together, working toward a common goal. Emily wasn't just surviving anymore, she was thriving. And it wasn't just about the improvements at work, it was about the impact they had on her life outside the restaurant. For the first time in years, Emily began to envision a future beyond just scraping by. She started to take small steps toward her dreams, exploring opportunities for further education, even considering moving into a management role herself one day. The hope that had once seemed so distant now felt tangible. What John had created wasn't just a job, it was a space where Emily and her co-workers could feel seen, respected, and empowered. It was a testament to the power of empathy and leadership that prioritized people over profits. Emily had been transformed not just by a shift in the workplace but by the profound realization that compassion could create real change. As she continued working at the restaurant, she did so with renewed purpose and vigor, no longer confined to the daily grind of survival but actively shaping her future. She knew that no job, no matter how humble, was beneath her. The key was having the right support, the right environment, and the belief that everyone, no matter their position, deserved respect and dignity. As Emily looked back on how far she had come from a woman resigned to the daily struggle of survival to someone with the confidence to dream and take action, she knew that her transformation was not just about her personal growth but also about the power of compassion and systemic change. She had seen firsthand how leadership, when rooted in empathy, could ripple outward, improving lives and communities. John's legacy of kindness and progressive change had not only reshaped the way she saw her job but also the way she saw her place in the world. It was a reminder that real change doesn't always come from grand gestures or sweeping reforms. Sometimes, it starts with one person's decision to treat others with dignity and respect, to see them for who they truly are, and to foster an environment where everyone can grow. In the end, Emily's story wasn't just about a better job or a more fulfilling career, it was about the enduring power of empathy and how it can create lasting change in the lives of individuals and in the systems that govern them. She had gone from merely surviving to truly living, and the future once clouded with uncertainty now seemed bright, full of possibility, and grounded in the belief that with the right support and compassion, anything was possible.